"We've been sleeping in your barn," said the 4 naked widows the rancher found at sunrise. The first thing I noticed was the boots. 4 pairs of them, lined up outside the barn door like somebody had been raised to do things proper even when everything else had gone wrong. 2 pairs cracked and trail-worn. 1 pair so new the leather still held its shape. 1 pair too small for a woman full-grown, somebody's daughter maybe, wearing her mother's hand-me-downs. I stood there in the gray before sunrise with a milk pail in my hand and the cold coming off the ground in thin white threads, and I looked at those boots, and I thought, this is not what I expected from Tuesday. I set the pail down quiet. The barn door was unlatched. I'd latched it the night before, I always do, on account of the gray mare getting colicky if the wind gets in, but it was standing a finger's width open now, and from inside came a sound I couldn't immediately name. Breathing. More than one person. And underneath that, the low complaint of my mare, which meant she wasn't afraid, just inconvenienced, which told me something. I could have gone back to the house and got the rifle. That's what a cautious man would do. But cautious men don't run ranches alone in the middle of nowhere, or if they do, they don't last. You learn to read situations the same way you learn to read weather, not from one sign but from the whole collection of signs at once. 4 pairs of boots, neatly placed. A door opened quiet, not kicked. A horse that's annoyed but not spooked. These did not add up to danger. I pushed the door open. There were 4 women asleep in my hay. Not in the stalls. They had the sense to avoid the stalls, which told me something too. They'd made a kind of nest in the far left corner where the hay piles deepest against the wall, and they'd used horse blankets, the heavy wool ones I keep stacked on the middle rail, and they were covered up to their chins and dead asleep, all 4 of them, like they'd been walking for a week and their bodies had simply stopped. My mare turned her head and looked at me like this was my fault. I stood there in the door for what must have been a full minute. The light coming in behind me was still thin and blue-gray, just enough to see by. I could make out their faces, 4 different ages, 4 different kinds of tired. The youngest might have been 22. The oldest had gray at her temples. They were not dressed. I could see that from the clothes folded on the rail beside the blankets, everything folded, everything placed, 4 separate stacks, each with a woman's discipline to it. I backed out, pulled the door to, stood in the cold and thought about things. My name is Harlan Beck. I have run this ranch, 380 acres of Montana bench land, 200 head of cattle, more trouble than a man can account for in a single telling, alone for going on 11 years. My wife Cora died in the winter of our 3rd year here, influenza, and there is not a morning in those 11 years that I have not thought about her before my feet hit the floor. The ranch was ours together in the beginning. Then it became mine to maintain in her memory, which is a different thing, heavier, but it gives you a reason to work which is almost as good as a natural one. I am not a man people describe with warmth. The town of Kipling, 12 miles east, regards me as reliable but not sociable. I have 4 friends and I haven't seen any of them since last spring. I am 54 years old, I have more gray in my beard than I'd like to count, and there are mornings my right knee tells me things about the weather before the sky does. I am not the kind of man women choose. I know this about myself clearly, the way you know where the fence posts are on your own land, not because you measure them, but because you've been walking the same ground so long you'd feel it if one went missing. I went back inside the house and put the coffee on. Then I came back out with a second pot and set it on the flat stone beside the barn door, along with 4 tin cups and a clean cloth, and I went and did the morning chores: chickens, pigs, water for the trough, check on the 2 calves in the south pen, and by the time I was done the light had come up full and gold and I could hear voices inside the barn. Low at first, then louder, then the sound of someone saying something sharp and someone else saying something back, and then a long pause. The door opened. The woman who came out first was the one with gray at her temples. She was wearing her dress and her boots, but her hair was still down, and she had that particular look of a woman who has decided not to be embarrassed because embarrassment would cost too much energy she doesn't have. She looked at the coffee, then at me, then at the coffee again. "You made coffee," she said. "It's a habit," I said. She picked up a cup, looked at me sideways while she poured it. "You're the rancher." "Harlan Beck." "Nora Prentice." She drank. Her eyes closed for just a second, the way eyes do when something hits right. "The others are getting dressed. We'll be out of your barn inside the half hour." I apologize for the intrusion. "Where are you headed?" I asked, because 12 miles from anywhere is too far for 4 women on foot at sunrise to have anywhere sensible to go. She looked at me then, really looked, and what was in her face wasn't shame or calculation. It was a particular kind of exhausted honesty that women get when they've been managing a situation past the point of pretending. "I'm not entirely sure," she said. The others came out while we were still standing there. The young one, Meg, I learned later, was maybe 22 and had a gap in her front teeth and looked at everything the way people do when they're trying to memorize it in case they have to describe it later. Beside her was Ruth, who was Nora's age more or less, solid and dark-eyed and quiet, who looked at me, said good morning, and poured her coffee without ceremony. The fourth woman was a few years older than the other two, not old, just settled, with the kind of face that's been through some weather and come out knowing itself. Her name was Clara. She had a bruise on her wrist that she wasn't hiding but wasn't drawing attention to either, and the way she carried herself made it plain that she would not be discussing the bruise, and I should not ask about it. I did not ask about it. I said, "Breakfast is in the house if you want it." Nora looked at me. "You don't know us." "I know you're cold and you haven't eaten and you're 12 miles from the nearest town," I said. "That's enough for breakfast." There was a pause. The 4 of them exchanged one of those looks that women exchange when they're deciding something as a group without speaking. A whole conversation in about 2 seconds, and at the end of it Nora looked back at me and said, "Thank you, Mr. Beck." I fed them. Salt pork, fried eggs, biscuits I'd made 2 days before that were still worth eating, coffee. They ate with the specific focus of people who had not eaten recently and were trying not to show how much that mattered. I did not watch them eat. I sat at the head of the table and ate my own breakfast and asked no questions. And after a while, because silence at a table with 5 people in it tends to fill itself, Nora started talking. They were all from the same town. Calvert Creek, a day and a half's ride east, through Kipling, and then another 8 hours if you pushed it. All 4 of them widows. Ruth's husband had died of a bad fall off a warehouse roof the previous November. Clara's husband, and here she spoke quickly, with a particular flatness that told me what the bruise on her wrist was about, or near enough, had died in March, circumstances she was not elaborating on. Meg's husband had been 24 years old and had drowned in a river crossing that everybody said shouldn't have been dangerous. Nora's husband had died the February before last, slow, from the lungs, and she had spent the last 14 months keeping the other 3 from falling completely apart. They'd been planning to go to her sister's place in a town called Birch Falls, up near the Canadian border. A man in Calvert Creek had offered to drive them in his wagon in exchange for, and here Nora stopped and looked at the surface of the table for a moment, and said simply that the exchange had turned out not to be acceptable, and they had left the wagon at night and started walking. I did not ask what the man had wanted. I knew what the man had wanted. "How far to Birch Falls?" I asked. 3 days by wagon, Nora said. "We don't have a wagon." "And no horses?" "No." I drank my coffee. Outside the window the morning was getting on. I could see the light on the east pasture going from gold to white, the grass still bent from the frost. I had fence to mend on the north side. I had a water pump that was making a sound I didn't like. I had calves to check and cattle to move, and about 47 other things that were not feeding 4 stranded widows in my kitchen. I said, I can take you to Kipling this afternoon. From Kipling there's a stage that goes north twice a week. Day after tomorrow, I think, is the next run." "We don't have money for the stage," Meg said. She said it straight, the way young people say hard things when they've decided not to be ashamed of them anymore. "I'll cover the fare," I said. A quiet came over the table that I hadn't anticipated. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, it has weight. "Why would you do that?" Clara asked. She wasn't hostile, she was precise. There was a difference. She had the look of a woman who had learned to ask exact questions, because vague answers had cost her. "Because it needs doing," I said, "and I have the means to do it." Clara held my eyes for a moment. Then she nodded, small once, and looked back at her plate. That settled it, I thought. Drive them to Kipling, pay for the stage, be done before supper. That is not what happened. What happened was that about 2 hours later, while I was out at the north fence pulling staples and resetting posts, Nora came out and stood near enough to hand me things without being asked. She didn't explain herself. She just watched me work for a minute and then picked up the staple puller and started in on the next post down the line. She worked efficiently. Not the way a woman works who's trying to impress you. The way a woman works who has done physical labor before and knows how. I said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I know." And she kept working. Meg came out around noon with a plate of food. She'd gone into my kitchen and made dinner out of what was there, cornbread and beans, and a piece of cured ham she'd found hanging in the larder, all of it arranged on the plate with a kind of care that made it look like more than it was. She set it on the fence post nearest me and stood back and looked at the line of fence and said, "How much more?" 60 more feet roughly, I said. "Ruth and Clara could help," she said, "if you wanted." I looked at her. 22 years old, gap in her front teeth, her husband drowned in a river crossing, and here she was offering to put 4 widows to work on my fence line on the day I was supposed to drive them to town. Not asking permission exactly, offering a trade. "I don't need the help," I said. "I know," she said. Same 2 words Nora had said. Then she added, "But it would give us something to do, and something to do is better than sitting thinking about things we can't fix right now." I stood there with a fence staple in my hand. "All right," I said. So that afternoon it was 5 of us on the north fence, Nora and I pulling and resetting the posts that had heaved in the spring thaw. Ruth, who turned out to have forearms like a blacksmith and a laconic efficiency I'd seen in maybe 3 people in my life, handling the wire. Clara using the post mallet with a steadiness that said she was channeling something into it and didn't mind if the post knew it. Meg running the water bucket and keeping count of the staples, which doesn't sound like much until you've tried to keep track of staples with 4 people working. We finished the north line by 4 o'clock. I went to hitch the wagon. Nora came and stood at the corner of the barn while I worked, and she said, "The stage doesn't leave until day after tomorrow." "I know," I said. "I'll take you into Kipling tonight, put you up at the hotel." "With what you're paying for the stage fare," she said, "that's a considerable expense." "It is," I said. A pause. "We could stay here until the stage." I stopped what I was doing, not because I was surprised exactly, but because I wanted to think about it before I answered. "There's only the 1 bed in the house," I said. "I'd be in the barn." "We've slept in your barn before," she said, and there was something in her voice then, dry, understated, with a current underneath it like a river with a fast center, that made me look at her. And when I did, she was not quite smiling, but her eyes were doing something that was in the neighborhood of a smile. "So you have," I said. I unhooked the horse from the post. "Day after tomorrow," I said. "Day after tomorrow," she said. That was Tuesday evening. By Wednesday the ranch had a different feeling that I couldn't account for and did not examine too closely. Clara had found the garden I'd let go fallow on the west side of the house, Cora's garden, once, and without saying anything about it had started pulling weeds, and by afternoon she'd gotten Meg helping her, and the two of them had the beds turned and the worst of it cleared by supper time. I noticed but didn't comment. Ruth had taken to my chickens with a warmth that I found, if I am being honest, a little touching. She talked to them while she collected eggs. Not baby talk, but a kind of low, steady commentary. The way you'd talk to someone who understood you fine and just wasn't going to answer. And Nora came out again that morning while I was working on the water pump, and she said, "What's wrong with it?" I told her. It was the piston seal, gone soft, and I'd been putting off replacing it because you had to disassemble 3/4 of the pump to get at it, and the last time I'd done it I'd been 2 days doing it wrong before I figured out the right sequence. She looked at the pump. "I've done one of those," she said. "My husband and I had one at our place in Calvert Creek. Different manufacturer, but probably the same principle." "Have you?" I said. "Tell me the sequence," she said. "I'll tell you if it matches what I know." We spent 2 hours on that pump. She turned out to know the sequence correctly, and between the two of us, her holding things in place, me doing the actual wrenching, both of us talking through the steps, we had it back together and running clean by mid-morning. Not a triumph, just a thing done that had needed doing. But there is a particular feeling you get when you've worked on something with another person and come out the other side with it working, a feeling that is its own small satisfaction, and I had not had that feeling in a long time. I washed my hands at the water trough. "You're good at that," I said. "You could have done it without me," she said. "I could have," I said. "Took me a day and a half last time, though." She looked at the pump. There was something in her face I couldn't entirely read, not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it. A woman who has been useful and knows it. A woman who has not been useful in a while and remembers the feeling. "My husband wasn't much for this kind of work," she said, not bitterly, just as information. "I learned most of what I know because if I didn't learn it, it didn't get done." "Where'd you meet him?" I asked. I don't know why I asked it. It came out before I thought about it. She was quiet for a moment. "We were neighbors," she said. "Grew up next properties. I knew him most of my life. It was," she stopped, started again. "It was comfortable mostly. Not all of it, but mostly." She walked back toward the house without making it a big thing, and I stood there and watched her go, and I thought, comfortable mostly. And I thought about Cora, who had been everything I knew about the word love, who had died in our 3rd winter and left me to run this place alone. And I thought about what comfortable mostly would mean to a man who had spent 11 years with only the cattle and the fence lines and the gray mare for company. Not what I had imagined once, but the imagination changes, you can't help it. Wednesday supper was different from Tuesday supper. Not noisier exactly, but fuller. All 5 of us at the table, and a conversation that moved between them the way conversation does when people have spent a day working alongside each other, and something between them has loosened. Meg told a story about her late husband trying to ford a creek on horseback, and the horse's reaction to a frog that made all of us laugh, and she laughed too, which I think was something she hadn't let herself do about him yet. And I watched her face while she laughed, and there was grief in it and relief in it at the same time. Ruth said almost nothing all through supper, same as she'd said almost nothing all day, but at the end of it she looked at me and said, "This is good food." And she said it the way some people say it's a good day, not a compliment exactly, just an acknowledgement, the kind that means the most from people who don't give many. Clara said, "Your wife had a garden." I said she did. "It could be saved," Clara said. "Another week and it'd be too far gone, but it could be saved now." I looked at her. "You spent your day doing it." "Some of it," she said. "It needs more." "It doesn't need to be saved," I said. "I don't tend it." "I know," Clara said. She said it evenly without judgment. "I just thought you should know it could be." I thought about Cora's garden all the way through washing the plates. How she'd had it laid out, what she'd grown in it, the smell of it in July when the beans came in. I'd let it go to weeds 3 summers ago, and before that I'd tended it badly, and before that I hadn't tended it at all, and there had come a point where looking at it was harder than not looking at it, and I'd stopped looking. I went out that night and stood at the edge of it in the dark. The weeds were pulled, like Clara said. The beds were turned. You could see the shape of it again, the rows Cora had put in, the corner where she'd put the herbs, the path between the beds that she'd lined with flat stones from the creek. 11 years. You'd think a person could let a garden go to weeds in 11 years. 11 years should be long enough for that. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for the cold to get into my coat. When I turned to go back to the barn, I was sleeping in the barn as agreed, which was not comfortable but was right. The kitchen window was lit, and I could see through it that someone was still up, moving around in there, and for just a second the scene through the window was so ordinary, so lit and warm and populated, that something in my chest did a thing I wasn't prepared for. I stood outside in the dark for an extra minute. Then I went to the barn. The stage left on Thursday afternoon. That morning was clear and cold, and the kind of blue that only happens in Montana in the fall when the air has dried out and the sky is showing off. I got the wagon hitched after breakfast, and the 4 women brought their things out. They hadn't had much when they arrived, and they didn't have more now, 4 bundles and a satchel between them, and loaded up without being asked to. I was about to climb up to the bench when Nora said, "Wait." She was standing beside the wagon. She had her hat in her hands, turning it by the brim, a nervous gesture, I thought, the first nervous gesture I'd seen from her. "Something wrong?" I asked. "Clara's wrist," she said. "I know about her wrist," I said. "The man in Calvert Creek," Nora said. "He wasn't the wagon man. He was her husband's brother. There's been a situation since her husband died about property, about the house. He has some standing in it legally, I think, though I don't know the law well enough to say it right. When we left Calvert Creek, he was very angry." I stood there with my hand on the side rail. "She's not safe going to her sister's?" I asked. "She's safer there than in Calvert Creek," Nora said. "But Birch Falls isn't. We don't know if he'd follow, whether he has legal means to compel her to return. We don't know any of that." "Is that why you were walking instead of taking the wagon?" I asked. Nora looked at me steadily. "We left in the middle of the night," she said. "We left because Clara needed to leave, and the rest of us were not going to let her leave alone. That's all." I thought about that. 4 women in the dark, no wagon, walking 12 miles across open land at night to sleep in a stranger's barn. Not in a panic, not in disorder. Boots lined up outside the door. Clothes folded on the rail, 4 separate stacks. "Does she know you're telling me?" I asked. "Yes," Nora said. "She said I could if I thought it was relevant." "And do you," I asked, "think it's relevant?" "I think," Nora said carefully, "that a man who drives a wagon 12 miles and pays for a stage fare for 4 women he doesn't know might want to know what he's in the middle of, if he's in the middle of something." She was right about that. I said, "I know a lawyer in Kipling. He does land matters mostly, but he's good and he knows the statutes. If Clara wants to talk to him before the stage, I can arrange it." Nora looked at me. There was that thing in her eyes again that wasn't quite a smile but lived near one. "I'll ask her," she said. Clara wanted to talk to him. We went to Kipling. I arranged the appointment while they waited at the dry goods store. They needed a few things, practical things, and I told them to put it on my account, which produced another one of those looks that I was starting to be able to read. That 4-way conversation in 2 seconds, and this time the conclusion they reached was to accept without argument, which I thought might mean they'd decided something about me. The lawyer's name was Stoddard. He'd been in Kipling 20 years. He knew land law in this territory as well as anyone this far north, and he was the kind of man who didn't make women feel small for not knowing things, which is rarer than you'd think. He saw Clara for an hour. When she came out, she looked different. Not fixed, nothing was fixed yet, but like someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing at arm's length and had just been told she was allowed to set it down for a minute. "He thinks I have a case," she said. "He thinks the brother's claim is weak under territorial statute, but it'll cost to contest it." "Can you contest it from Birch Falls?" I asked. "He says I can file by correspondence," she said. "He can represent me in Kipling if it comes to a hearing." "Do you have the means for his fee?" I asked. She looked at me with that precise, exact look she had. "Not at present," she said. "I'll advance it," I said. The look she gave me then was different from any look she'd given me before. Not gratitude exactly. Gratitude would have been easier. This was the look of a woman recalibrating something, revising an estimate, looking at a man she thought she had entirely figured out and finding a piece she hadn't accounted for. "Why?" she said, same word she'd used at breakfast the first morning. "Because it's right," I said. "And because if the brother's claim is as weak as Stoddard says, you'll prevail, and the property can be sold, and you can repay me from that." "And if I can't repay you," she said. "Then you can't," I said. "That's what I'm willing to risk." Another of those four-way looks. Then Ruth, who had barely spoken all day, said, "Harlan, my first name, not Mr. Beck. Do you have a family somewhere, a brother, anyone?" "No," I said, "no family." She nodded, like that confirmed something she'd been working out. We had supper in Kipling at the hotel dining room. All five of us, which occasioned some looks from the people who knew me, because Harlan Beck eating supper with four women was not something Kipling had ever had occasion to witness. I ignored the looks. The women ignored them too, or didn't notice, or noticed, and decided it was not worth their energy, which I thought was the right call. Meg talked a lot at supper, which I'd come to understand was what she did when she was anxious and trying not to show it. She talked about the town she'd grown up in, a place in Colorado that sounded both beautiful and difficult, and about her late husband Will, who had apparently been terrified of horses and tried never to show it, and about how she'd found that out only after they were married and it had made her love him more, not less. The fact of him trying so hard every day to be unafraid of something he was genuinely afraid of. After supper, I was going to leave them at the hotel and go home. That was the plan. Nora walked me out to the wagon. The street was mostly quiet, just a few men coming out of the saloon down the block. The night was cold and very clear, and you could see the mountains to the west with the last light on them. "The stage is at 2 o'clock, she said. "I know," I said. "You don't have to come back," she said. "You've done more than enough." "I'll be here at noon," I said, "in case there's anything that needs doing before the stage." She looked at me. In the lamplight from the hotel window, her face was clear and direct, the face of a woman who was used to looking at things straight on because that was the only way things got handled. "You live alone," she said. "I do," I said. 11 years, she said. She'd remembered what I'd told her at breakfast that first morning. 11 years, I said. A pause, not an uncomfortable one. The kind of pause that has something sitting in it, waiting. "I'm 47 years old," she said. "My husband was a decent man, and I loved him, and he was comfortable mostly, as I said, and I do not have any illusions about what a woman my age with nothing to her name is worth in the way of prospects. I just want you to know that I know what I am." "What are you?" I asked. She looked at me evenly. "A woman who fixed your water pump and helped with your fence and cooked in your kitchen and slept in your barn," she said. "Who is about to get on a stage and go somewhere she's never been to live with a sister she hasn't seen in 6 years. That's what I am." "That's what you're doing," I said. "I asked what you are." A small silence, the lamplight. "Someone who could have been useful to you," she said, "if things were different." I looked at her for a long moment. I'd been looking at her, on and off, for 2 days, and I'd been not looking at her too, which takes more effort and means something. "What would different look like?" I asked. She was quiet for longer than I expected, When she spoke, her voice was level but not indifferent. "I don't know yet," she said. "I haven't let myself think about it." I climbed up onto the wagon bench. She stood there, her hat still in her hands, looking up at me. "Noon tomorrow," I said. "Noon tomorrow," she said. I went home and did not sleep well, which is not my habit. I lay in the barn listening to the gray mare breathe and thought about the garden, the shape of it in the dark, the flat creek stones along the path. I thought about 4 pairs of boots lined up outside the door. I thought about the particular way a person looks when they are allowed to be useful and remember the feeling. I was at the hotel at noon. The stage was loading at 2. There was time between noon and 2, and what we did with it was sit in the hotel dining room and drink coffee, all 5 of us, and not talk much. And the not talking was full rather than empty. The kind of quiet that comes between people when they have done things together and arrived somewhere without particularly planning to. Clara looked better than she had 2 days ago. The bruise on her wrist was fading from purple to yellow, and she sat with her back straight and her hands flat on the table with a kind of quiet authority that had probably always been in her and had just been pressed down for a while. She'd send the letter to Stoddard from Birch Falls. He'd told her what to say. Meg kept looking out the window at the street. "I've never been to the Canadian border," she said. "It looks like here," Ruth said, "just colder." "Everything looks like here but colder," Meg said. "That's either comforting or discouraging, I can't decide." "Both," I said. Meg looked at me, the gap in her teeth when she smiled. "Both," she agreed. At 1:30 I carried their bundles to the stage. There wasn't much. A man my size handles 4 people's worldly goods in 2 trips and has 1 hand free on the way back. I didn't say that. I put the bundles in the stage boot and checked the straps and stood back. Ruth came up beside me. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she held out her hand and I shook it and she said, "Come visit if you're ever near Birch Falls." "I've never had cause to go that far north," I said. "That's a thing that can change," she said, and she got on the stage. Clara shook my hand too. Then she looked at me with those exact, precise eyes and said, "Thank you, Harlan. I mean that the way it should be meant and not any lighter than that." "You're welcome, Clara," I said. "Good luck with Stoddard." "Write me how it goes," she said, not asking permission. Telling me she expected it. "I will," I said. Meg threw her arms around me and hugged me like I was someone she'd known all her life, which nobody has done since Cora, and I did not know what to do with my hands for a second, and then I put them on her shoulders the way you would with a daughter, and she pulled back and looked at me with bright eyes. "You're a good man, Mr. Beck," she said. "I just wanted you to know that somebody thinks that." I didn't have anything to say to that. I nodded. She got on the stage. Nora was last. She stood there in front of me and looked at me, and I looked back at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment. "The pump will need looking at again in 3 months," she said. "The seal's still soft. It'll do for now, but don't leave it too long." "I know," I said. "The north fence," she said. There were 3 more posts that were loose but not collapsed, about 40 yards from where we stopped. "I'll get them," I said. "And the garden," she said. "You don't have to, but Clara's right, it could be saved." I looked at her. She was holding my gaze and her own was steady, a woman who had been looking at hard things straight on for a long time. "Nora," I said. "Yes," she said. "How long before you know whether Birch Falls is where you want to be?" A pause. Something shifted in her face, not surprise exactly. More like a woman recognizing a question she'd been waiting to be asked. "I don't know," she said. "I've never been there. I know my sister. I don't know the rest of it." "Write me when you know," I said. "Write you," she said. "I'm not hard to reach," I said. "General delivery in Kipling. I'm in town most weeks." She looked at me for a long moment. Then something that was not quite a smile settled onto her face. Not the almost smile I'd been seeing for 2 days, but an actual one, small and private, the kind you give when you're not performing it for anyone else. "I'll write you when I know," she said. She put her hand out and I took it, and she held it for a moment that was longer than a handshake and shorter than anything else, and then she got on the stage. I stood in the street and watched it go. Past the dry goods and the barber and the last building at the edge of town, and then out onto the north road where the land opened up and ran flat and wide toward the distant tree line, and then it was small, and then it was gone. I drove home alone. The ranch was the same as it had been before Tuesday, which is the only way a place can be. It doesn't change itself for you, it just sits there and waits. I unhitched the horse and put her up and walked the property before the light failed, checking the things that needed checking. The calves were fine. The trough was full. The north fence held. I went and stood at the edge of Cora's garden in the last of the light. The beds were turned. The creek stones were visible along the path, the flat ones Cora had gathered over several summers, carrying them up from the water one at a time. 11 years. The weeds were gone, or most of them. You could see the shape of the thing again, what it had been, what it could be. I stood there for a while. The light went. The cold came in off the mountains the way it does in October, clean and absolute, and above me the sky went from blue to indigo to black, and the stars came on one by one the way they always do, unhurried, like they've got all the time there is. I went inside and lit the lamp. The house was quiet. The table was clean, the way they'd left it. They'd washed the plates that morning before we left for town, all 4 of them working together in the kitchen with the kind of unspoken coordination that comes from women who have been working alongside each other long enough to stop thinking about it. The cups were stacked. The coffee tin was back where it belonged. There were 4 tin cups still sitting on the flat stone outside the barn door from Tuesday morning, and I'd forgotten about them, and I went out and got them and washed them and put them with the others. I thought about what Meg had said, that somebody thinks you're a good man. I turned that over for a while, the way you turn something over to see how it wears. I got out paper and a pen. I wrote to Stoddard, confirming the advance for Clara's legal matter, and told him to expect correspondence from Birch Falls. Then I sat there for a while longer with the paper in front of me. Then I wrote one more letter. Short. General delivery in Birch Falls, care of a woman named Nora Prentice, in care of her sister, whose name I'd gotten from Meg over supper the night before because I'd thought I might want it. I told her the pump was holding. I told her the north fence was holding. I told her the garden was still there when she wanted to see it. I told her there was no hurry. Then I put down the pen and blew out the lamp and went to bed, and the ranch sat around me in the dark the way it always had, solid and mine and too large for one man, 380 acres, 200 head, more than enough to fill a life. Enough maybe for 2.